Welcome to this online lecture as part of the Politics of Crisis Management module. Today we're going to be focusing on the crisis response and the politics of that, including looking at issues to do with sense making and decision making. This is part one of two lectures that are looking at decision making and crisis. Up till now we've had discussion of pre-crisis planning. We've looked at the issues and complexities around that. The natural next step is to think about some of the challenges with the decision making process in crisis management. So today we're going to consider the politics of crisis response and also to kind of think about how this topic links with the wider issues in the politics of public policy. It's very, very important to understand, like I've said before in the module, that crisis management is a policy making activity, and we cannot remove the wider issues of public policy analysis from the discussions of the politics of crisis management as an exercise. We also have to think about some of the challenges and issues associated with making sense of crises as they happen, but also making sense of the contours of decision making. So that's going to be the key themes that are underpinning the input today. So what do we know about the normal challenges of public policy? We have a quote here on the slide from Brewer and De Leon, who basically consider that in normal routine conditions of policy making there are aspects of decision making required, and these involve certain things and challenges. The authors note that the choice among policy alternatives that have been generated and the least likely effects on the problem estimated. This is what decision making is. It is the most overtly political stage insofar as the many potential solutions to a given problem must somehow be winnowed down, but one or a select few picked and readied for use. So obviously, most possible choices will not be realised, and deciding not to take particular courses of action is as much an art of selection as finally deciding on the best course of action. So that gives you a kind of idea of what we're talking about when we're discussing the features of decision making in normal times. You can imagine how acute and how exaggerated these issues may be in times of crisis. We also have to think about the fact that decision making requires an element of legitimacy behind it. So if we think about legitimacy, legitimacy is born through many different avenues, and the literature on policy making talks about the idea of legitimation. And basically what this suggests is that policy is based on having some type of support through a combination of legislative approval, executive approval, a consent from the public through referendums, or referenda I should say, and also through consultations with interest group organisations, which can come in many forms. They might include pressure groups that are campaigning over particular policy issues, or it might be broader economic groups who are seeking to think about the economic considerations around public policy. A range of organisations may have particular policy solutions that might become part of the decision making process, but the government have to be able to sit down and say, well, we've actually had this policy decision approved by this group, that group and the other, in order to bring a level of legitimation to the process. Public support is very important as well, as we know from politics, that legitimacy is a key part of how we understand political processes, and mass approval and obedience to what policymakers do is very important in many senses. We can think about times, even during crises, whereby the legitimacy of government decision making has been called into question in some senses. During the foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001, what happened was some farmers didn't want government vets to come onto their farms in order to cull their animals, because they thought to themselves that, well, actually, do you actually have the right to do so? This is my property. What power do you have in order to actually enter my property and to take my livestock away from me? So that's what farmers were saying during that time. So they questioned the legitimacy of the government's decision-making approach to disease containment with foot and mouth. That led to a number of legislative reforms, legislative changes through the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2002, and so on. But before the Act came along, there were questions about, well, actually, how legitimate is this Act in order to come onto my property and to take away my resources and so on. So there was a number of issues there. So the broad point is that legitimacy is very important as part of the decision-making process. I mentioned in the previous slide that there are a range of policy instruments that policymakers can draw on at any given time during the decision-making process. It's almost like having a toolbox, if you like, or a series of options that the government might actually think about using when it comes to dealing with problems. Decision-making in politics and in public policy is about trying to deal with a problem. What are the best mechanisms, options that you have to deal with a problem? So this is something that policymakers will be very interested in thinking about. Now, it might be a combination of different options that a policymaker tries to use in order to satisfy an issue or to address a problem. But they come in various forms, and these range from voluntary to mixed to compulsory instruments. So an example, a voluntary instrument might be that the government require the voluntary sector to implement public policy. For example, when it comes to dealing with issues to do with welfare policy, animal welfare policy, the RSPCA in England and the SSPCA, animal charities in Scotland, they implement government policy on animal health and welfare. Okay, but they're a voluntary organisation not funded by the government. So in some ways, they're an instrument, if you like, a policy instrument to implement animal health and welfare legislation. But you also have subsidies. There might be state subsidies for schools to provide free school meals, for example. Or it might be that there are a combination of taxes and charges, as well as compulsory instruments used by government. The compulsory instruments are usually things that require direct provision, public ownership, public enterprise. An example of a compulsory instrument would be the renationalisation of the railways. Okay, so it's thinking about the range of different options that you have, but the reality is that each combination, and whatever combination you use, requires an element of electoral support, a public support. There's a number of factors that influence the choices that decision makers might want to draw on when it comes to identifying which instruments to use. Examples of that might be the ideological perspective of the government of the day. So it might be that, for example, a more neoliberal government might not be too happy about using too many compulsory instruments because of their belief in the private market, the free market, and that might play into how they decide to choose a policy instrument. So it's very important to kind of think about the politics of this and the role of ideas, the role of ideologies. In terms of crisis management, though, one of the things that we do find is that quite oftentimes that when there is a crisis, there are elements of centralisation and central government coordination that come into play. And we've seen that already from some of our discussions on the module, that through COBRA, through the Cabinet Office in the UK, for example, at first there might be this kind of centralisation of the communication of the response. But that's on the basis that it will allow for coordination across a range of organisations. There's debates in the literature as to whether this centralisation thesis, if you like, when there's a crisis, that prompts more centralisation. There's a debate in the literature about whether that's appropriate and how that chimes with ideas about resilience. Resilience being that responses to crises should be local, and it should involve coordination on the ground rather than centrally. So there's a number of debates within there in terms of how the ideological perspective of the government kind of plays out in terms of the crisis response, whether they allow for centralisation or they allow for decentralisation, and in what conditions that those things happen. Okay, usually when it comes to crises that have kind of cross-border implications, like migration, like terrorist attacks, things like that, one of the things that we do find is that cross-governmental coordination becomes very important in quite a centralised way, because they have to coordinate efforts at a bigger scale, because what you have is cross-border implications emerging from crises. So there's a range of different issues and contexts we have to be aware of in this debate. One of the key things that's important to bear in mind is that in normal or kind of non-crisis public policy, one of the things we often have when we talk about public policy decision making are models of policy making and ways to understand them. Although we have introduced incrementalism and rational models of policy making in earlier lectures, it's important for us to bear these in mind in terms of the specific phase of the module, thinking about decision making, because one of the things we want to think about is how it takes place. What is the manner upon which decision making takes place? Does it become a scientific process? Is it managerialist approach, more akin to a kind of rational type approach, whereby you're trying to calculate all potential eventualities of the policy instruments that you decide to use? Or is it more a case of just operating on the hoof, muddling through, changing things incrementally? If you change things incrementally, does that mean that you're being responsive and adaptable? And is that a good thing when it comes to crisis management? Because basically what you've got is events, and you have to respond to unfolding events. So having a flexible and incremental approach might be seen as good. On the other hand, depending on the context, you could turn around and say, well, doesn't that just look like a kind of haphazard approach to dealing with crisis? Is it something that's not particularly rational, if you like? To what extent do these models of policy making allow us to unpick the challenges of the crisis response? It's important to bear in mind, though, that it's not just about rationalism and incrementalism. It's not an either-or scenario. Okay? I mean, Etzioni developed the idea of the mixed scanning model in order to think about how we can actually scan, taking a long-term view of what could happen in the future in terms of public policy. So it's almost like kind of taking a kind of horizon scanning approach, looking strategically at what the policy issues might be in the long term, and the range of different alternatives and options that you might be able to employ to deal with these long-term issues. So the idea is that it builds in aspects of the rational model whereby you're trying to look at alternatives, you're trying to look at options, and you're trying to appraise options in many ways. Having said that, there is elements of the incremental model as well, because identifying and framing what the actual policy problem was and which options should be generated around this is seen as more of an incremental process, right? So the idea is you look in the long term to think about what are the long-term policy solutions that we might have, but when it comes to actually addressing the policy solution, we might have to take more of an incremental approach to it. Okay, so it's this idea about bridging rationalism and incrementalism, and it might be that this can be quite useful when thinking about crisis, because as part of a risk management strategy or a contingency planning strategy, what you're trying to do is look in the long term to think about, what are the kind of key risks that are going to be potentially important for us to deal with as public policy makers in the long term. So an example is that NHS England or NHS Scotland will have a risk register to think about what are the kind of public health crises that might occur, and how does that have implications for the work that we do. These things might happen in the long term. So, for example, there are risks on the risk register for NHS England, for example, relating to pandemics of disease, and also issues to do with terrorist attacks. There's issues to do with the health outcomes in terms of inequalities. All of these different things are kind of on the risk register, but so you know they're there, and you might actually be able to put in place a calculated and rational approach to think about the policy solutions for dealing with those things. But when it comes to the situation whereby the risk manifests itself, so say for example there's a pandemic flu outbreak, and basically what you've got is public agencies having to coordinate and work together across sectors, the actual dealing with that issue might be more of an incremental approach. So there's almost a kind of combination of policy styles. It's important to bear in mind that there are actually other models of policy making that are quite relevant in thinking about how policy making can be quite haphazard, not necessarily scientific, not necessarily rational. And this chimes with a theoretical perspective offered by March and Olson, who think about the garbage can model as a model of decision making. And they basically argue that akin to a garbage can whereby you would throw in different bits of litter, and there would be no system, there'd be no process or logic to it. You just throw stuff in. That basically what that is akin to is the decision making process, when you've got many actors coming together in a quite a haphazard way that isn't strategic, isn't rational, and is quite haphazard in many senses. In some ways, many ways actually, the garbage can model has been criticised because of the fact that it might lend itself better to some state contexts over others, i.e. where there's more fragmentary systems of governance, such as the US. But even so, the broader picture here is that to suggest that policy decision making, even during a crisis period, is completely irrational or completely haphazard could be a bit of a stretch in some ways, because basically what you've got, even if a crisis is not going too well in terms of the governmental response, quite oftentimes there are elements of rationality to decision making, elements of coordination, and perhaps the garbage can model is very limited. But remember, the key point here is that institutional contexts are very important, okay? And the environment upon which decision making is made is very important. If you have an institutional setup which lends itself to strategically focused approaches to coordination and so on, then this helps to dampen the impact of any type of haphazard approaches. So the idea here is that it's important to understand different models of policy making, because there might be bits and pieces across different models that can be applied to your chosen crisis case study. Another dimension to this issue of decision making in crisis and public policy more generally is the extent to which evidence features and should feature as part of the policy process. Essentially, during public policy decision making, there needs to be some type of information to inform what happens, and in times of uncertainty, the demand for information is very severe and fast-paced, and it's very important for public communication that the information that's contained when any briefings to the public by policymakers is evidence-based. And we know from the academic literature on public policy that evidence itself is something that's quite subjective, and it's not one thing. It can be made up of a number of things. And evidence is quite political in itself, because the manner in which evidence and data is collected and presented can be politically sensitive. And so we have to remember that evidence gathering is a social process. It's not always a scientific, value-free process. And we have to bear that in mind, because at an abstract level, that helps us understand the complexities of what evidence is all about and the challenges of taking evidence as read. But also, beyond that, there's questions about the nature of evidence in terms of how it features in decision-making processes. So if we look at the quote here by Klein, he talks about the fact that evidence is only one part of the policy-making pie in many senses, in that policymakers have to address a number of drivers and issues, including what's publicly acceptable, what's politically feasible, what the resources they have in terms of, do the resources meet up with the challenges that they need to actually address. So there's a number of different issues. Evidence is important, but that needs to be seen in the context of a balance of interests and influences across the policy spectrum. We talked before about earlier in the module about policy subsystems, and within subsystems there are a number of different interests and agendas, and they might seek to use evidence in different ways. So for us as students, it's about understanding the nature of the evidence that features in policy processes, and whether and to what extent evidence features at all in the process. Ian Anderson has written quite a lot about evidence-based policy making and some of the debates around that, so I would encourage you to have a look at some of Ian Sanderson's work. But it's also important to remember that the debate in policy making more generally is starting to move on a little bit from ideas of evidence-based policy making to one of evidence-based practice. In other words, it's about how you implement and how you actually put things into practice in an evidence-based way that is most important here. So there's a kind of slight shift in emphasis in many senses, but policymakers will want to say that they're taking an evidence-based approach, that they've consulted the best evidence possible. But sometimes the evidence just isn't there, and we have to bear that in mind, that sometimes there are gaps, and where there are gaps there needs to be intellectual judgment put into place, and that's where political leadership comes in, what we're talking about a couple of weeks ago in the module. Political leaders have to make judgments informed by pragmatism, what's feasible, what's sensible, and that's not always straightforward, and if you get it wrong then it can have serious repercussions. Just you think about the nature of a crisis situation. If you were in charge and if you did have to put out a communication strategy to the public that things are being taken care of and here's what to do in certain circumstances and here's the procedures that you need to follow, what you'll want to do is to take an evidence-based approach to demonstrate to the public that you are being evidence informed. And basically what that comes back to is ideas of legitimacy. You don't just get legitimacy through public support, parliamentary support and so on. The actual act of saying you have an evidence-based policy is a form of trying to construct legitimacy through word, through symbolic politics, because it aims to reassure, it aims to demonstrate a level of competence. So there are questions here, and there's questions about whether evidence should feature as part of the policy process. As you can see from Klein there, we cannot assume that evidence is one thing, that it's not saturated by values, because it is. We all know how official statistics, inverted commas, have been used and manipulated for different reasons to suit certain policy agendas. Well, that comes back to a number of different issues in politics, which is to do with the role of ideology and the use of information, the nature of political ambition, point scoring, and how you use evidence to actually do that. So we have to bear in mind that this is politics. Politics and evidence are inextricably linked. It's also important to bear in mind that the actual political system itself is important in terms of the nature of decision making in public policy. And this is no different when it comes to times of crisis. To what extent is there legislative oversight or judicial oversight of what the government does? To what extent does the bureaucracy of the state, such as in our system, the civil service, have a role in decision-making processes? Now, we know that the civil service and the bureaucracy is the administration of the state. It's the kind of arm of the state, if you like, and they implement government policy, and that's no different in times of crisis. Civil servants, bureaucrats implement government policy with regards to managing incidents, threats, disasters, disease outbreaks, a number of different things. So they're often implementers, and the debates in constitutional terms with the bureaucracy often is, to what extent are these crisis managers essentially who are actually implementing government policy to deal with crises, to what extent are they faceless? To what extent are they faceless in the bureaucratic or the political system? Now, you could argue that essentially and strictly that bureaucrats are accountable to their political masters, the kind of ministers, the political heads of department that the officials are working within. However, with the advancement of scrutiny through parliamentary processes like select committees and so on, it's interesting to see that actually what you find is civil servants, usually of a senior nature, can be quite exposed within public forums, such as Parliament, to answer questions on the performance of the government department. So when we had the crisis of the passport agency a year ago, Keith Vaz, who is the chairman of the Select Committee for Home Affairs, called in the senior civil servants working within the passport agency to answer for their performance, if you like, in dealing with the issues in the passport agency. So there's questions like that. It's questions about accountability, the nature of decision making, the power of the legislator, and when it comes to holding government to account, the executive to account when it comes to crisis management processes. You'll find that during a crisis, the Prime Minister will often stand up in Parliament and give a statement about the nature of the governmental response. So, to what extent does that play out in different jurisdictions? What are the checks and balances? What roles do courts play in judicial review after a crisis has happened? How does that have an impact on the inquiry process? All of these different things are very important to think about in terms of structuring the decision-making process. Again, another slide here looking at the Canadian system in the United States. To what extent are there checks and balances, for example, in the US on what the president does? You probably already know from your studies of American politics that the president doesn't actually have a huge amount of power, believe it or not. Or shall we say, the president has a number of checks and balances on what they do through the judicial process. So basically what you've got in the US, there's a strong emphasis on legislative committees. You've got a system whereby there's checks and balances between the judiciary, the executive and the legislature. So how does that play out in public policy and decision making? Well, these are the types of questions that we need to think about in terms of studying particular crises. To what extent was the legislature involved in a particular crisis? To what extent did the executive or was the executive held to account by the legislature after a crisis happened? So post-crisis politics and decision-making around crisis management is very relevant to the nature of the political system at hand. And that's a question for you to ponder. So what implications do you think the nature of the decision-making or political system will have for the crisis response in the area that you have chosen? In terms of thinking about the issues that we've discussed thus far in the lecture, it's important to kind of think about the nature of policy options and how political these can be. Selecting policy options is an important part of the formulation of a decision-making process, or the formulation of a decision that is put into practice. But is this done rationally? Is it done incrementally? Is it somewhere in between? How do we know? What evidence do we use to actually make that judgment? As I said before, Ian Sanderson is really interested in the interface between evidence and public policy, and the questions about whether evidence actually translates into the selection of the best policy options. Do you go with the policy options that have a clear evidence base, or do you go with the policy options that are most politically expedient and are subject to less political scrutiny? So there's a range of issues there to think about. What happens if there's not an evidence base? Does this require greater political leadership in the crisis management response? Is policy made on the hoof? Okay, so these are the types of things to think about. Is policy making rational? Is it haphazard? Is it incremental? And what implications does that have for the effectiveness of crisis management? An aspect of decision making that's very important in the crisis management literature is associated with sense making. How you make sense of complex events in times of threat and uncertainty. So sense making refers to the element of surprise, attempts to comprehend, and levels of disbelief and collective stress, right? So how do you actually deal with these things? It leads to policy questions, such as could the crisis have been prevented? Why didn't we see this coming? So 9/11 is a good example of that, in the sense of you've got a situation depicted on our television screens of a catastrophe. And what goes through your mind during that process? Well, you'll be wondering why this is happening. What are the causes? What are going to be the implications of it? Even trying to get to grips and come to terms with the harrowing pictures that you're seeing. You know? These things could be very difficult. Now, for policymakers, what they're trying to do is make sense of what's happening, but also to make a political judgment of what to do next. So making sense of complex events is very important. But what are the barriers to crisis detection? Well, there can be many. Politicised environments coupled with the lack of resources and expertise can be a barrier to crisis detection. Many public sector bodies are reactionary. They're not necessarily tuned up sufficiently to take a risk management or horizon scanning approach. Now, we talked about this last week when we talked about contingency planning, and that actually what you really need is to build up institutional memory for dealing with crisis, but to take a strategic approach, to think about the long term, to have contingency plans in place, and to undertake crisis simulations in a regular time period to learn lessons from them consistently. It's about keeping the memory alive, keeping the organisation tuned up to be focused on resilience and to be able to be flexible enough to deal with complex events. So there are barriers to crisis detection in the first place. In many ways, we need to actually think about the nature of human beings and psychology as part of this process as well. And that as human beings, our cognitive patterns are such that we often form or conform to established ways and patterns of thinking that aren't always necessarily subject to adaptation, in such a way that it can be difficult to deal with stress and cope with ill-structured and complex problems. Stress can be bad for your health. Acute stress can be bad for your health. And if it's bad for the individual's health, what about the health of an organisation? The health of the crisis management actor? Okay? This becomes even more difficult if we think about the context of modern crisis, because if you're trying to manage something that has cross jurisdictional implications and is related to aspects of globalisation, involves a number of partners working on a global and a multi-level sense, then does this make the crisis even more ill-structured, and does this make stress and the ability to cope with complex threats any easier? Well, arguably not. So there are fundamental issues with the human condition when it comes to crisis. And that also relates to limitations in terms of the human ability to acquire and process complex information due to overload. So there is a literature out there which looks at the cognitive and psychological aspects of crisis management and our capabilities, and how our capabilities don't always match with political expectations or expectations of what the public might want. The public might want the policymaker to marshal a range of evidence sources to develop a very clear and concise communication strategy and a public message when a complex crisis hits. But actually, are we able to do that as human beings? So humans are beset with limitations in complex situations when it comes to monitoring and analysing highly complex social and physical environments. We are capable of great intellectual feats as a human species, but to what extent can we rely on being tuned up and fluid enough and be flexible enough to change our patterns of thinking, to be able to deal with complex situations and to manage high levels of stress? That might not necessarily be something that we can take for granted. Nisbet and Ross talk about this, and they talk about the experience of crisis and threat can be processed in quite a haphazard fashion, and we cannot remove biases from what individuals do and how individuals weigh up different forms of evidence of what to do next. We all have biases about what is good evidence versus bad, what is the right thing to do. What about issues to do with morality? There might be questions about belief in terms of what we should and should not do in public policy decision making. At the extreme, you might find that policymakers even mask or downplay the seriousness of an emerging threat, because if something is an acute threat, if something is a big problem, then the policymaker will be ever more exposed to that in terms of their performance, their competence, and much more media and political scrutiny will be attached to big events which call into question the competence of government. So there would be a temptation there for policymakers to downplay the seriousness of a threat. Paul Hart and Boyne, they look at this issue. It might be that communicating a business as usual image, displacing perceptions of a crisis and obscuring details of a crisis might be something that a policymaker seeks to do to protect themselves. We talked about in previous lectures about the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food previous to the creation of DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, after 2001. But before that, MAF and the Minister in charge, Nick Brown, wanted to present an image that MAF could cope with the foot and mouth crisis, to present a business as usual image. Don't worry, everyone, it's fine, we're going to get this crisis under control. That was to demonstrate that he was on top of it. Was there deliberate masking happening there? Well, that's for you to decide. But what is clear is that a full comprehension of the scale of the crisis wasn't in evidence in that situation. And basically what happened was the Prime Minister and other agencies and the Cabinet Office had to intervene to coordinate the crisis. Now, communicating a business as usual image might only take you so far. But there's certainly a temptation there from a political point of view, if you want to try and minimise levels of scrutiny that come to you and are directed at you when there's a crisis. It's also important to bear in mind that the literature considers this issue of stress and suggests that the complete absence of stress can actually be counterproductive. It can lead to enhanced alertness and motivation to have a certain level of moderate stress. It can lead to better performance, but excessive stress can be negative and lead to what we call the law of diminishing returns, whereby actually what happens is that it leads to stagnation. It leads to poor information processing, unclear lines of decision making, and basically it can be negative. But some degree of stress can be functional during crisis because it allows you to actually deal with the problem, recognise there's a problem, and call in support where it's required, and that can be important for performance. It's also important to think about resilience in this context. Now, resilience is something that the government would want to present as something that the government does on a routine basis. That has this kind of idea of resilience, which is we're able to be flexible, deal with the crisis locally, take a partnership approach to deal with a crisis situation. And the actual word itself is characterised in many senses. But there is a certain level of inexactitude about the definition of resilience. It's one of these terms that's quite difficult to pin down, a bit like crisis itself. But it's associated in academic circles with a number of terms. And it's often seen as a logic, a buzzword, a strategy, a normative concept, a doctrine, an ethos. Now, this is something that policymakers want to say that they're doing well. But if we think about some case studies, such as health security, in 2014-2015, if we think about Ebola as a modern crisis, if you like, because of the multi-jurisdictional implications of that crisis, that really did require international systems to be resilient in terms of bringing in multi-partnerships, to be flexible to response, to have clarity over institutional roles and responsibilities. So this is to avoid a disorganised system of response, if you like. However, we do know from Ebola that one of the key lessons learned, and we saw this when we looked at the video a few weeks ago in the lecture when we looked at the Ebola crisis in the seminar, was that the response to Ebola was seen as a bit lacklustre initially. There was a sense of disorganisation and a sense of belatedness in terms of the response by governments around the world to deal with this problem that originated in the West Africa in 2014-2015. So we can't take resilience for granted. It takes investment, it takes commitment. And if you elevate that to the international system, whereby you require different governments to come together to respond to a complex situation, then that calls into question issues to do with cross-state relations, the politics of international relationships, questions about sovereignty, questions about resourcing. So do all countries offer resources to deal with a crisis that has multi-jurisdictional implications? If we think about the migration or refugee crisis we've seen in Europe, to what extent have all countries been equal in terms of giving resources to deal with the problem? Well, that's been something that's been left wanting in many senses, because different countries have offered different levels of support and resources to deal with the crisis. And the wider point here is about the politics of Europe and how that plays out in the crisis response. So resilience is one thing and decentralisation is one thing, but it depends on the case. It depends on the situation that you're looking at. And can we always remove power politics and interstate politics from this process? Well, arguably not. So successful resilience is really dependent upon being able to navigate complexity, given the context of interdependencies between governmental and non-state actors across multiple levels of government. This requires coordination, and knowing who is the coordinator can be a tricky business as well. There's a link here on the slide to UK Resilience, which is a website of the UK government, and it gives you a sense of the policies, procedures and strategy around resilience in the UK. So please take some time to look at this website. Building on what we've just said, the resilience literature does recognise the importance of governmental efforts to deal with crises when they do outweigh local capacity. Resilience these days, and increasingly, is being associated more with operational response, such as the creation of resilience forums to bring together multiple partnerships, such as first responders and policy actors. Resilience forums often tend to look at issues to do with urban planning, regeneration, and environmental and social issues, which can have a bearing on crisis response as well and decision making. There's really good examples here in terms of resilient cities that is part of an initiative by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the case study here is Manchester. And there's a couple of videos here that are very useful for you. Well, the YouTube video is useful to talk about the Resilient Cities programme, but also we've got the website for the UN there. And I'd encourage you to look at that website. What I'll do is provide the YouTube clip for the Resilient Cities initiative underneath the lecture podcast on the Moodle site, so you can see that in conjunction with these slides. However, we can't forget that in decision making, the centralisation thesis of crisis management is very important, and this gets us to question the government-centric nature of crisis management. However, centralisation is often the result of when crises outweigh local capacities, or when there are key political interests in being interventionist, or both. We need to remember that the UK government, for example, sometimes will want to demonstrate that they're on top of a crisis. That's a way to give a sense of competence. But it might be the case that a more localised response is appropriate, and there might not be the need for COBRA in the Cabinet Office to be convened. We need to remember that when it comes to a crisis, the first responders are very important, so i.e. the emergency services. And quite oftentimes it becomes a matter of politics when crises outweigh local capacity, or when there's a public policy implication for what has to happen next in terms of dealing with a crisis. So often that's when ministers and when policymakers will decide to get involved. But centralisation and the nature of the response, whether it's a local affair, whether it's a centralised affair, whether there's evidence of resilience, is something that you should be thinking about as part of your studies and reading on the module. Building on the idea of resilience is the idea of networks. As part of resilience forums, as part of a crisis management response, networks are important in terms of crisis management. Now, policy networks themselves have a long-standing presence in the public policy literature. Much of the writings on policy networks are associated with Rod Rhodes, who has written a significant amount about this area. And he's argued that interactions within and among government agencies and civil society organisations constitute policy networks, and that they are key to formulating policy, and that being what will be ultimately decided on in terms of dealing with a crisis. So the networks themselves vary. They might vary in terms of integration. Are they a close-knit network, or are they a bit looser? And that can be affected by the nature of their membership, the resources that they have, their level of insulation from other networks, and so on. If we take, for example, animal health security, the National Farmers Union is key as a key network actor that works with government very closely, actually. Works very closely with government. And that's a very good example of a highly integrated policy network, in the sense that those working within the National Farmers Union have key expertise of the agricultural landscape that feed into governmental decision making when it comes to a crisis that affects the countryside. But at the same time, The NFU want to work with policymakers in order to get the agenda that they want onto the policy table. There's strong stability of membership. The NFU are pretty well insulated from other networks. They're quite a significant, well-honed network in themselves. So, in many ways, they're a good example of a tight policy network. So, it's important to bear in mind that actually, there are networks that feed into policy processes. It might be that the networks are looser. If you think about health security, it might be that those in the animal and public health communities aren't necessarily as tight-knit as they should be, given the fact that animal infections can have public health implications, like we've seen with swine flu, Ebola, that originates from animal infection. So does avian influenza. Avian influenza has public health implications, especially the H1N1 strain of the virus. But to what extent are the animal health and public health communities part of a tight network? The public health side might be in a network, the animal health side might be in a network, but to what extent are they integrated sufficiently across the two? So in my research just now, I'm looking at this issue because it's interesting to see how these networks and these experts that work within these networks can have a significant impact on the nature of crisis management decision making. So for you, it's important to know that network theory and network approaches are an important thing to understand when thinking about government decision making, because what you find is that government decision making is part of an interaction, if you like, amongst a number of organisations, and the art really is for the policymaker to be able to choose who to go to, which agencies to involve, when should they do it, when it's appropriate to do so. Okay, so that's often the art of decision making in many senses. Just to elaborate on what we've been talking about in terms of policy networks, there's different ways to categorise networks, and one of them is policy communities, and that really does refer to your kind of tight-knit network. And here are some of the features, if you like, of a policy community. So they're comparatively limited in terms of their membership, often with professional or economic interests, sometimes consciously excluding others. They have shared values and frequent interactions. They may exchange resources with each other, and there's a relative balance of power across them. So a policy community is something that's a bit more tight-knit, that you can see work together very closely in times of crisis, or even in times of normal routine policy making. Issue networks are more loose, more flexible. The idea of a issue network itself, you probably comes to mind something that is a bit more flexible than a policy community, in the sense it's large and diverse. There are fluctuating levels of contacts and lower levels of agreement than policy communities, varying resources in terms of an inability to regulate their use on a collective basis. They're not characterised by the equal distribution of power within the network. So these can be very loosely defined. So an example of what we were talking about before, a policy community, could be what I was discussing in terms of the area of agriculture and animal health security and issues that affect the countryside, because there's a clear identifiable interest and network there. Health security is a little bit more diverse, because especially if we look at it in a broad sense across the animal and public health domains of security, the policy network there is much more loose, more flexible, a little bit less cohesive in some senses. So those are good examples of the differences there in terms of a policy community versus an issue network. By way of a summary here, there are challenges in decision making and in crisis management. Now, I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to you, that you could imagine a policymaker being subject to a number of constraints and issues during a crisis period, particularly when something has the public's attention and you've got 24-hour media that are looking for messages from government on what's happening. So there's a number of of pressures in a kind of era of 24-hour news to get the message out there as quick as possible. But the challenge for the policymaker is that actually this is a real challenge in terms of sense making. The politics of the crisis response is such that detecting a crisis and knowing what's going to come isn't always possible. But also, as human beings, we also have limitations, cognitive and psychological limitations in terms of how we can actually deal with stress and deal with situations. Okay? We need to be mindful of the importance of the public policy literature as much as the politics of crisis management literature. And there are many reasons for that. These include the nature of policy options available to you, who might lobby you for particular policy options to come onto the table, the nature of power relationships between different countries, different states, different jurisdictions, different territories, how that has an impact on resourcing a crisis management response. We know from the floods in 2007, 2014 in the UK, there's been lots of discussion about how the northern parts of England have been resourced enough to deal with crises of this nature, and quite oftentimes that is a issue for discussion when it comes to lessons learned from a crisis. Is what was the decision making process like? Did they give enough resources to particular parts of the country, different client groups to deal with the process? To what extent do policymakers have the tools at their disposal to put in place the most effective decision? We've discussed the nature of evidence. To what extent can we rely on evidence? Is evidence itself politically charged? Is it subjective? What evidence do we choose to present in certain ways? So these are all very political things that are inherently part of crisis management decision making, but arguably they're just as important for day-to-day, inverted commas, normal policy making processes. Okay? So we have to think about that. We also have to think about the context of political systems themselves. So does the decision making process, or is the decision making process aligned to the nature of the system? What about the balance between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary? What about forms of scrutiny and accountability upon the crisis management actor? To what extent does that have a role in the contours of decision making? These are very important questions. Also important is the debate about centralisation versus decentralisation in crisis management. So is it a centralised approach or is it more of a local affair? The resilience literature tries to get us to think about that in more detail. And there have been some fairly recent academic writings that look at this topic of resilience. And you can see that the United Nations has been quite interested in this idea of resilience and kind of funding programmes across different countries to look at the idea of the resilient city in recognition of the fact that it's the regions and cities and local authorities that are often responsible for actually doing the crisis management on the ground in terms of the operational response. So it does kind of get us to think about this in more of a broader sense in some ways, because it's not just about the nature of contingency planning, political leadership. It's not just about that. It's also about what you do as a decision maker and the most effective ways to do it. Okay, so we need to think about these things and be very clear about what the debates are, what the limitations are on policymakers, what is the nature of scrutiny on what policymakers do, and how we actually think about the crisis management process from that point on. One of the things that often comes up in inquiries is, to what extent was the decision making process rational? Was it too haphazard? Was it evidence based? To what extent did that feature in terms of the decision making process? So a range of different things happening there in crisis management politics. And next week what we're going to do is to build on some of this discussion by looking at the second part of this debate in class. And what I would like you to do is to think about. There's some references here for you to follow up on to elaborate on this lecture, and this slide provides you with some suggestions to get started. The Anderson article at the top in the Politics Journal is very useful because it takes you through the different ways in which resilience has been understood as an idea. You've also got a number of sources there looking at the relationship between evidence and policy, issues to do with the nature of decision making, the Taylor article there on the foot and mouth disease outbreak looking at policy on the hoof. You've got issues to do with sense making and a number of different sources here, but also you have some discussion by different academics within the public policy literature looking at issues to do with the policy process and the challenges with that. So the Kearney book and the Hill book, they look at the challenges of policy making more generally, and you can actually look at this from a crisis management lens and say, well, actually, to what extent do the challenges presented by Kearney and Hill, to what extent are they ramped up in a time of crisis? So you're not short of reading. I'd encourage you to do some reading around this, and we'll pick up on these themes in the lecture next week.